I'm Lisa Smart, and I'm the Lib Dem parliamentary candidate for Hazel Grove in the 2015. That's exactly the reaction I get from my local party every time I walk in a room. So it's very good that that briefing was made ahead. I would very much like to thank the Electoral Reform Society as well as Liberal Reform for organising this fringe. It's great to see a packed room. I think we're all up for a very interesting hour and a quarter. We've got 3 people on our panel here this evening, and I think we'll hear a very interesting range of views. I'll introduce them briefly. They'll all speak for about 5 to 7 minutes or so, and then we'll throw it open for questions. And I really would encourage you for questions rather than speeches, so that we can get as many people in as possible. I'm aware it's Lib Dem conference, but let's give it a go. So, our 3 speakers, we're going to go in the following order. Jeremy Brown is the MP for Taunton Deane. He was a Minister of State for Foreign Affairs for over 2 years before moving to the Home Office. I have heard his nickname, his name begins with J, and he was a Minister in charge of ASBO, so he was Jasbo for a little while, and he is the Pocket Files friend there. He was Minister until October of last year. Our next speaker will be Ryan Shorthouse, after Jeremy. Ryan is the Director of Bright Blue. He's the Tory on the panel. You can all be very...
Don't let yourselves down. No.
Yeah. Telling Ryan how polite and pleasant and welcoming everybody. So thanks very much. Bright Blue is an independent think tank and pressure group for liberal conservatism. And Nick Tyrone. Nick is the Head of Partnerships and Public Affairs at the Electoral Reform Society. Prior to this, he was the treasurer of the Yes to Fairer Votes campaign. So we have a very interesting panel with us this evening. And I think the first speaker is going to be Jeremy. Jeremy.
Well, thank you, Lisa, and thank you all for coming. And what I thought, I mean, first of all, my answer to the question is that Liberals should be in the Liberal Democrats. But rather than, you'd expect me to say that, rather than just sit down, let me expand a bit upon this point that you've all taken the trouble to come to York. But also, I toyed with how to sort of, how to pitch this. And one option was to spend a lot of time explaining to an audience overwhelmingly of Liberal Democrats why the Conservative Party is not a Liberal Party. But I think in a way that is self-evident to most Liberal Democrats, and in any way it isn't very challenging for you because we can all agree that we prefer the Liberal Democrats to the Conservatives, and given we're at a Lib Dem conference, that seems to me unadventurously safe ground for me to take. So what I want to do actually is challenge you a little bit more, I hope, by asking why this fringe meeting is even taking place. In other words, why is it necessary for us to have a debate about whether Liberals should naturally be in the Liberal Democrats? Isn't that automatic? And if it isn't automatic, and I assume it isn't, otherwise you wouldn't have come to the debate, should that give us cause for concern, and what can we do about it? So that's the pitch I intend to take. Now, let me sort of take a step back. The argument is often made that in the last 30 years or so, which is roughly my memory, I suppose, of British politics, the last 30 years or so, the right have won the economic debate. So we as a country have gone down the path of greater capitalism, free trade, free markets, and the right, so the argument goes, have trumped the left in that aspect of our national political debate. But, the argument goes, and it's often made by commentators, the left, when it comes to, if you like, the social outlook of our country, our attitudes towards immigration or towards people whose lifestyles in the past would have been regarded as unconventional, that the left have won that debate. In other words, there's been a sort of score draw. The two great forces, the right and the left, have each shaped the country in a way to their liking, but they have had to concede in another area that the argument has gone in the way of their opponents. I don't accept that argument. I think that the two great directional changes over the last 30 years, both economically and in terms of our social outlook and personal lives, have both seen unambiguous victories for liberalism. That actually, far from being a one-all draw, liberalism has won 2-0. And I think the question for us, and the thing that ought to concern us, is given that there is a good reason to believe that the country in both of those areas have gone in a liberal direction, how is it that we, the Liberal Democrats, have not been emphatic beneficiaries of the country becoming a more liberal country? Why is it that we are on 8 or 9% in the opinion polls? Why is it that we have never managed to win a tenth of the MPs in the House of Commons? And maybe most troublingly of all, why is it that when people look at us as a party and seek to understand what we believe in and what we represent, they are left uncertain about what it is that the Liberal Democrats believe in? I think they have a sense, they may not always be right, that they know what Labour believes in, and they know what the Conservatives believe in, they know what UKIP believes in, they know what the SNP believe in. When it comes to the Lib Dems, I think there is a bit of uncertainty, and that is in part, I think, because of our own ambiguity about liberalism, that we haven't essentially believed in and championed our own brand, even though that has been the dominant and most successful strain of politics over the last 30 years. And as we're talking this 10th anniversary year of the Orange Book, and it's in the title, I thought a sort of useful way to try and understand where we might have done better, where we might have lost our way a bit, is to look at the broad definitions of liberalism that are in that book. And I think in two of them, but unfortunately probably the two that matter least to the voters, we are seen as being fairly clear in the public mind about our liberalism. So in terms of our political liberalism, or sort of constitutional liberalism, it is pretty much uncontentious that we are in favour of political reform. And nearly every Lib Dem I've ever met thinks that we should reform the House of Lords and we should have a more proportional voting system, etc., etc. And in the area of personal liberalism, if you like, sort of private realm, we are by and large again associated with being comfortable with a society which is more diverse in terms of ethnicity or sexuality or whatever it might be. And there is a sense, I think, a little bit that particularly the Conservatives, but maybe both of the other parties, have had to learn to become comfortable with that type of Britain, whereas it comes to us instinctively. So I think in both of those areas, I'll put a slight caveat that I think in some areas of personal freedom we are in danger of losing our way in terms of having very prescriptive attitudes towards how people live their private lives. But that is a separate debate for a separate fringe meeting. I think in those two broad areas, personal liberalism and political liberalism, people don't actually have a clouded view of us. They think we are quite nice, reasonable, decent people. They don't believe we're racist, they don't believe we're homophobic, and they do think that we're in favour of proportional representation. So, in those areas, I think we are seen to espouse liberalism, and people understand that. And they value it up to a point, but they take it for granted because they see the other parties as either broadly representing those values as well, or they don't care very much about those particular policy issues. And they are in our own comfort zone as a party. You know, go to a Lib Dem conference and argue for proportional representation is not a brave thing to do. The two other areas of liberalism are more important, and I think in those is where we have the greatest ambiguity. So the first is economic liberalism. Now, capitalism, if I can use a sort of shorthand, is completely transforming the world in which we live. Hundreds of millions of people in Asia are seeing themselves lifted out of destitution and are enjoying lifestyles that are materially far superior to anything that their parents, let alone their grandparents, could ever have imagined. And yet, in this country, after all, a lot of pioneering economic liberal thought originated in the United Kingdom. But in this country and in our party, there is some ambiguity, I think, about economic liberalism. If you talk about entrepreneurialism, wealth creation, enterprise, profit in our party, people slightly sort of shift nervously in their seats. When we talk in our conferences and in our motions at conferences about wealth creation and profit and enterprise, we're normally talking about how we can tax it or regulate it. We are very rarely talking about how we can encourage it and promote it. So here you have this great liberal phenomenon, which is emancipating hundreds of millions of people around the world, and which has changed the nature of the economic debate in this country over the last 30 years as well. And yet the Liberal Democrats are nervous about that aspect of liberalism, because I suspect we sense that it might make us look a bit too selfish or too individualistic and insufficiently caring. But whatever the reason is, we are not undiluted in terms of our willingness to espouse economic liberalism.
Yeah, yeah.
And then the other area is social liberalism. Now, I think quite a lot of people may feel that social liberalism is an area that the party is more comfortable with. But what I'm quite sort of struck by is that if you look at the great issues of our time, in terms of what we can do to remould our country to make it more socially liberal, do we have the sort of pioneering radical spirit that social liberals had after the Second World War, when they wanted to create a country fit for heroes and their families? And my nervousness is we don't too often, that we are actually a Conservative party with a small c. What we are trying to do is to make sure most of the time that nobody upsets the post-war settlement, even though society has changed dramatically since the end of the Second World War. So, for example, I would say some great social liberal challenges of our time are people being trapped in welfare dependency in households where maybe nobody has ever worked, or where children are growing up without an expectation that they will work themselves, and that they live lives that are not just materially poor but are spiritually poor as well. And I think that is a big task. But what can we do about that divided society, the so-called underclass? I don't really like the word.
Money.
But what can we do? And I don't accept, because that is the post-war sentiment, that the way you make somebody poorer is to give them an extra £5 a week. I think you have to look at what you can do to make, and if you give them £6 a week, you care about their plight more than if you give them £5 a week. And if you really care about their plight, you give them an extra £7 a week. I don't accept that that is a radical, imaginative solution to a big social ill that should be a challenge for social liberals. I'll give you another one. I'll give you three quickly. Our cancer survival rates in every category of cancer are worse than they are in France and Germany. In some of them, they are markedly worse. Your 5-year survival rate from memory on kidney cancer in this country is, I think, 46%. In Germany, it is 70%. Now, people who are dependent on the health service, there might be some people who can afford private healthcare, but most people are dependent on the health service. I think that should be a big challenge for social liberals. What can we do to raise our healthcare standards so that they are similar to those, in terms of outcomes, to countries that are comparably rich and similar to us? And yet we seem again to be cautious about going far down that path. Let me give you a final one. Education outcomes. I think we have a globally successful elite education provision in this country. We have some of the best universities in the world, and they're recognised as such. Why is it that Chinese and Indian students want to go to Oxford and Cambridge and London universities? Because they recognise these are global leaders. Why do the sort of slightly stateless, global, moneyed elite want to send their children to our independent schools? Why, for example, Dulwich College opened a Dulwich College branch in Shanghai? Because they recognise that we are global leaders. Some of our state education is excellent as well. But not enough of it. We are global leaders at elite level, but in the middle level we are not performing as well as we need to, and in these international comparisons we are not in the top 20 for any of the three categories. We're not going to be a knowledge economy if the competition is more knowledgeable than us. And at the bottom level, children eligible for free school meals, 2/3 of those children fail to get 5 A to C's at GCSE, including English and maths. There's a very high correlation between coming from a poorer background and educational failure, and there's a very high correlation between educational failure and your life chances in all kinds of other ways. This should be a massive, massive opportunity stroke challenge for social liberals, for liberalism. But we're quite cautious in these areas as well. And we end up in a very strange, and I think we should be troubled by this position, where the two most pronounced reformers, one could argue, in the cabinet are Ian Duncan Smith, who may be many things, and you may admire him or you may dislike him intensely. He's not a liberal. I don't think he would claim to be a liberal. But he is willing to countenance new ideas for trying to tackle problems I talked about in terms of welfare dependency. And we are, for my tastes, too willing to try and sometimes define ourselves by how successful we are at frustrating him. Rather than trying to think of superior ideas to his, we seem to be keenest to be seen by the public as being the party that may thwart his implementation of his ideas. And the other, even more controversial politician, is Michael Gove. Now, you may or may not like the reforms that he is proposing, but I think the onus on us as liberals, given that we have this problem with a lot of educational underachievement, even failure, particularly among children from poorer backgrounds, is if we don't like his reforms, what superior reforms are we putting forward ourselves? And again, I sense that quite often we are the brake rather than the accelerator when it comes to addressing some of these deep-seated liberal problems. And that when we seek to differentiate ourselves from our coalition partners, which I'm not against us doing, because I want us to explain why we're different and what we believe in, but when we differentiate ourselves, we shouldn't do it on the basis that we are more enthusiastic about the state than the Conservatives, and we're more enthusiastic about preserving the status quo than the Conservatives. Neither strengthening the state or having a default conservatism make you a liberal. In fact, I'd argue that both of those are the opposite of liberalism. So, if you like, in conclusion, what is the best prospect for us as a country, I think, in terms of addressing our need to try and create wealth and opportunity and use some of that wealth and opportunity to create greater social mobility and opportunities for people from all backgrounds and superior public services, and to live in a benign, tolerant, liberal society? I think that authentic liberalism, sort of unashamed liberalism, is the answer to our national problems. And I think it's the answer to our Liberal Democrat brand identity problems, if you want, as well. Which is, I think, the reason people don't understand what we stand for sufficiently is because we lack clarity when it comes to explaining what we stand for. Where we are clear, proportional representation, for example, people do understand. They might not care or agree, but we are clear and people do understand. But I think in quite a lot of areas, they see the big social liberal challenges of the time, and they don't see a commensurate liberal response from us. They see the world being transformed with economic liberalism, and they sense ambiguity from us as well. So my conclusion is this. I don't think that the answer to how you advance liberalism in this country is for Liberals to join the Conservative Party, because I don't think the Conservative Party is a liberal party. What I do think the answer should be is to make sure that the Liberal Democrats are not a small c Conservative Party, and that we are a liberal party ourselves. In many ways we are, but I think we shouldn't be slapping ourselves on the back. I think we should be thinking about how we can be more unambiguously and authentically liberal in the future.
Thank you, Jeremy. Giving us a few things to think about there. Buying an automatic car amongst them, because you need just a brake and an accelerator. There's no need for a clutch there. Ryan, why don't you give us the Conservative response to that?
Okay, thank you, Lisa. I've got a feeling that this is going to be a tough sell. I'll have a go, anyway. And indeed, I was talking to Nick Thornsby from Liberal Reform, and I was in London. It was very sunny and warm, and I said, I'd best get a warm reception here if I'm leaving warm London. And indeed, I have a feeling that perhaps I might get a warmer reception here than I do sometimes in the Conservative Party. We'll see about that. I think in answer to the question, which party for Liberals, I think the truthful answer is both. Both parties can be a home for Liberals, and both parties have a rich history of advancing liberalism. indeed in the Labour Party too. And I realise I sound like I'm sitting on the fence, but I am at the Lib Dem conference after all. So I'm in good company. So I think the real question is not where do Liberals belong, but which party will best advance liberalism, both economically and socially. So when I think of liberalism, I'm thinking of the classical liberalism, not just now, but in the decades ahead. And which party is most likely to ensure liberal policies and ideas are implemented in the country? And I think the answer is the Conservative Party. And that's why I think if you're a Liberal, you should join the Conservatives and vote for Conservatives. I'll come to that in a second. But first, let me just tell you about the Conservative Party's long history with liberalism. And we can start, I'm not going to go through all of the centuries, but certainly we can start in the 1820s under Lord Liverpool, who was a Liberal Tory. And it was there, sort of following Adam Smith and Edmund Burke, they had advanced the sort of economic liberal reforms that allow free trade to prosper. So monopolies were restricted, the Navigation Act was relaxed, custom duties were reduced, and restrictions on exports were abandoned. And indeed this led, despite a sort of slowing down of this sort of free trade reforming zeal, slowing down in the 1830s under the Whigs, it then reignited again under Robert Peel when we had the famous repealing of the Corn Laws. So I think it was then that you really saw a sort of economic liberal direction being taken by the Conservative Party. But alongside that economic liberalism, I think there has been, if we conceive of social liberalism as the empowerment of individuals, I think the Conservative Party has a long history of doing that as well. The abolition of slavery by the Tory William Wilberforce, the Factory Acts by the Tory Shaftesbury, which enabled workers in tough working conditions to have basic rights. Under Disraeli, the vote was extended to many more working men. And let's not forget, today is, of course, is International Women's Day. And the Conservative Party has a long history of the emancipation of women. So Emmeline Pankhurst, for example, led the fight for votes for women, and she was adopted just before her death as a Conservative candidate in Whitechapel. And indeed, it was under Stanley Baldwin in 1928 that all women received the vote. In fact, I think it was in the 20th century, with the rise of socialism, that it was the Conservative Party which was seen to defend liberal economic ideas. And I think Lord Salisbury in 1882 first detected this when he said, "In respect to personal freedom, the issues of politics are shifting. The Liberal Party is less every day the party that supports liberty." And indeed, I think after the post-war period, in the post-war period rather, we were seen to be championing economic freedom and liberty. So in 1955, for example, our election slogan was conservative freedom works. And eventually with Thatcher, we saw economic liberalism really expanded with the privatisation of key industries and market-based reforms to public services. And indeed, it was because of the strength of our liberalism that many Liberals themselves came over to the Conservative Party. So of course, the Liberal Unionist Party, when the Liberal Party was fragmenting, the Liberal Unionist Party under Joseph Chamberlain, after a period of coalition in 1895, eventually it merged with the Tory Party in 1912. Some of us in this room will probably want to repeat of that sort of situation, but I'm not sure, other than me, that would likely be supported. And then, of course, from 1947, the National Liberal Party in local areas stood in connection with, in affiliation with the Tory parties, right until the 1960s. Indeed, Michael Heseltine stood as a National Liberal in 1959. So that's to say there is a rich history of liberalism in the Tory party, just as there is, of course, a rich history of liberalism in your party. And even today, as Nick Boles said in a recent speech, which you may or may not have come across when he was talking about the revival of the National Liberal Party, he talked about the reforms that government, the Conservative Party has pursued in government, both economic and social liberal policies. So the legalisation of gay marriage, the removing of the tax burden for more people on low incomes, the freedom for schools, for example. Well, Saatchi and the Centre for Policy Studies have long, and Policy Exchange have long campaigned for it, as indeed you have as well. So also freedoms for schools, the sort of academisation and more freedom over pay and who they employ, who headmasters employ in terms of the qualifications people have. Also, greater power to local councils through the removal of ring fencing, for example. So that's just to name a few liberal ideas which have been implemented by the Conservative Party in coalition with the Liberal Democrats. And indeed, some Lib Dems have opposed liberal measures whilst in coalition. Enabling schools, for example, to recruit teachers even if they don't have a teaching qualification. Enabling childcare settings, for example, to relax ratios so they can focus on quality rather than quantity. Enabling a range of providers, for example private providers, to bid for more NHS contracts. A referendum on EU membership. Here are just a few things which I think are ideas which Liberal Democrats have opposed, which are liberal ideas. And that's not to say that you're not the true Liberal Party, and indeed the Conservative Party has promoted ideas which I think are illiberal. For example, the cap on immigration, which I don't support. What I'm doing is making the point that political parties are coalitions themselves, with liberals sitting alongside people who have different principles, whether it be equality, justice, order, truth, which they want to promote, but liberals sit alongside them. So I think the point is that liberals have long had a home in both the Conservative Party and the Liberal Democrats, and will find a home now. But the real question, I think, is where is liberalism more likely to be advanced? Both now and in the future. And I think there's 2 points that I want to say on that. The first is politically, purely politically, the Conservative Party is more likely now and in the future to be in power than the Liberal Democrats because of the first past the post system. Now, I actually opposed the Conservative Party's stance on first past the post. I actually agree with moving towards AV and eventually STV. But under the current arrangement, it is more likely the Conservative Party will be in power. Not all policies, when the Conservatives are in power, are going to fit within the Liberal definition. But as history has shown, in many areas, the Conservative Party is likely to advance economic and social liberalism. And for that reason, if I was a Liberal and wanted more liberalism, I'd vote Conservative against the main opposition, Labour, which I think is less liberal than the Conservative Party. And secondly, the second point is I think in the years ahead, the challenges that we face will require strong economic liberal solutions. I'm thinking of the ageing population, climate change, the human capital race, competing with emerging economies and really delivering higher quality, higher skilled people in our workforce. And a society which is more fluid and where social isolation and loneliness is increasing. In a globalised, competitive world, relying on the state to fix these solutions will be too expensive and will thwart the innovation that we need to tackle these situations. I think it's the Conservative Party which will be most prepared and has the stomach to use economic liberal techniques, market-based techniques to tackle these problems, and indeed is already itself proving itself to be willing to talk about, create policy on these areas to tackle it. So, for example, social innovation, which Nick Hurd and Francis Maud are leading on in the Cabinet Office, to deliver public services in an alternative way, using market-based principles and social investment rather than just relying on state funding. Fees-based model to university, to make sure our universities remain world-class and have increased funding coming into them. It's the Conservatives who have been the most enthusiastic about using alternatives to simple state subsidy, but using innovative things like tuition fees. And also, sorry, just coming to the end, developing measures and techniques to tackle poverty which go beyond cash transfers. As Jeremy admitted, Ian Duncan Smith has been enthusiastic about employing alternative techniques rather than just cash transfers. So, in conclusion, without doubt, especially with increased education attainment, attitudes are increasingly liberal. The future is liberal, but the challenges we face will require liberal responses too. And I think it's the Tories who have the stomach and the foresight to apply them. For that reason, for our growing cohort of economic and social liberals, particularly in younger generations, I think the Conservative Party will be their natural home. And I hope you will join us.
Thanks very much, Ryan. It's always very interesting to hear how different witnesses of the same event can be very different statements to the police, and I think that was a lovely example there. The one line I'm going to take is that the future is liberal, and I think I'll take that one. So our final speaker is Nick Tyrone from the Electoral Reform Society.
Thank you very much. I'll start off by saying I'm here to offer an unabashed approval of the Liberal Democrats. So yeah, obviously I think that if you're Liberal, you should vote Liberal Democrat. I think, you know, for instance, I'm very glad that there are people like mine in the Conservative Party pushing a liberal agenda. I mean, as much as I care about Liberal Democrats, I probably, on the whole, care about liberal democracy even more. So the idea that there are people within, not just the Conservatives, but Labour as well, who are pushing both parties to be more liberal, I think is something to be applauded. I still think, though, that you have to look at, I mean, the basic fact is, would you prefer the country have a Tory majority right now or a coalition? And obviously, which side of that you fall upon will probably tell you a lot about what you think about the question. And obviously, I feel that we're much better off the country's much better off with us in government in a coalition than in a Tory majority. Taking on some of what Ryan said, I mean, I'm thinking about just going back in history and the Conservatives absorbing huge portions of the old Liberal Party in the early 20th century. And actually, a lot of that had to do with the divide, sort of the argument between Home Rule, which we could probably put sort of internationalism, and imperialism. So the old sort of imperial, and a lot of the old liberals, unfortunately, felt very passionate towards the empire and went over to the Conservative Party. And I think that there is a baggage of this within the Conservative Party now, and I would argue for that reason that actually, I would sort of argue against Conservatives as actually being an economically liberal party, which sounds rather strange, I think, to some people, who I might associate them with that. The classic example is Europe and immigration, which actually, when you look at the Tories, are immediately combined, because I think a lot of the anti-EU feeling is actually about immigration. You know, if you think about why the Tories want to be out of Europe, a lot of it is about open borders, and a lot of it is about immigration and the control thereof. And I think if you're going to be economically liberal, it's very difficult to be economically liberal and argue that, you know, the best skilled people shouldn't be able to come and do the jobs. You know, I think, and particularly arguing against the EU, which is a single market. You know, I think you can make a very good argument from the left, for instance, for leaving the EU. You can say, well, look, we'll never have this socialist state where we can protect this, that, and the other. But actually, from the right, from at least right economically, it's very, very difficult to argue against the EU, because it is. That's what it is. It's essentially a single market. Yes, it has other things built into it, and yes, it has freedom of movement as well as freedom of goods and services. But I think that, as a liberal, I think that's absolutely crucial, because I don't think you can have sort of one without the other. So I would say that about economic liberalism. I think when I look at us as a party, I think there's a lot of talk about this. I think it's overplayed, this dynamic of the difference between the social liberals and the economic liberals, the sort of orange bookers and the XLFers, and a lot of us focus on our differences, what divides us. But I actually think there's a lot more that unites us. I think one of the things that I think is great about the Dems from all corners is the fact that we have a genuine argument about the size of the state and what matters. You go to Tory conference, you want to get a clap, all you have to say is you talk about shrinking the state. And everybody will go, hey. You go to Labour Party conference, you talk about growing the state, everybody will clap. What's great about us is I think that we can have a genuine conversation. Now there's people who might think that there needs to be more state intervention than others, but I think, or I hope anyway, we're mature enough as a party to keep the tradition that we've had of being able to talk about this and remember that I think that we have more in common than I think we have that divides us. Looking at the Tories again, I would probably say, again, sort of coming back to the liberal side, someone like, I don't want to pick on individuals particularly, but someone like Chris Grayling as Justice Minister, I think as a liberal it's very hard to support. I think there is a large contingency, a very large contingency, I would say the majority feeling within the Conservative Party, that has a fundamentally different look on crime and justice than I think most Lib Dems do. I think we tend to look at it from a perspective of we want to eliminate as much crime as possible. That is the point of the penal system. That is the point of crime and justice. Whereas I think the Conservatives tend to more look at the retribution side of it, the sort of the sin side of it, if you like. And I think that's illiberal myself. But I guess that depends on your definition of it. So I'd just like to close by saying, yes, I hope that that we don't develop factionalism that I have seen in the Tories and Conservative Party, the Conservative and Labour parties, because it's if you've seen it up close, it's pretty unpretty. Really pretty ugly, actually. Sort of seeing, I have seen members of their own party at conference getting into a fist fight usually about some old thing that happened in some by-election in 1982. So I hope that never happens. That's how I'll close. Thank you very much.
I'm going to take questions in threes, and I again please ask that it's a question, not a small speech, and if it's under 2 sentences, you get an extra special cheer from me. So thank you. The gentleman here, 1, 2, and then 3 here, please.
David Pevin from Poole. I first joined, or became a Liberal under Joe Grimmons, but then was influenced by Jeremy Thorpe to vote Conservative both in 1970, because there was no Liberal candidate. A question to Jeremy and a parallel one to Ryan. Do you think, Jeremy, that the merger with the Social Democrats made any difference to our liberalism? And to Ryan, do you think if the UKIP does grow at all, will it make any difference to the Liberals and the Conservative Party?
I'd rather answer that one, I think.
John Cole from Shirkley, Yorkshire, West Yorkshire. My question, I suppose, really is for Jeremy. It is going back to 2010 in the making of the coalition. If one possibly perceives David Laws and Danny Alexander as being economic liberals, did that make it easier to form a coalition with the Conservatives, given the nature of economic policy? That's my question. I'd have a further quick comment, which, Jeremy, I'm afraid what you were saying about the successes of neoliberal policy was a load of bollocks. I had a superb lecture, 9 days ago, superb lecture by a Cambridge professor of Leeds University, Harjun Chang, written a book, 23 Things They Don't Tell You About Capitalism. And he's totally dismissive of neoliberalism.
Thank you very much. Gentleman at the front.
Jeremy Brown said that the right has won the economic debate in the last 30 years. He overlooked mentioning that it actually crashed the system in 2008. So does he feel that a little bit of humility is appropriate? He also said that the economic liberalism has led to great growth in the third world. that also led to a great deal of continuing poverty and slavery. And that textile building in Bangladesh did actually fall down. Is there a need for some government regulation?
Thank you very much indeed. Okay, first question. Did the merger with the SDP make a difference?
Shall I try and do the
Why don't you do them all together?
Thank you. Is that the right? Stream, indulge me very quickly. I thought Ryan's speech very interesting. I still have a nagging sense that when he admitted at the beginning that his speech would be much better received at a Lib Dem conference than it would be at a Conservative conference, he undermined his central pitch, which is that the Conservative Party is instinctively sympathetic to liberalism. I think a lot of Conservatives, many of whom are quite reactionary, but not all, and Ryan is an exception to that, would have been extremely hostile to his history lecture and told him to go and tell Lib Dem conferences about all of these things instead, which I'm pleased he's taking the opportunity to do, but I'm not sure it's an entirely rounded picture of the Conservatives he painted. In terms of the question, well, I joined the Lib Dems in 1988, just after my A-levels, and people used to say, were you in the SDP or the Liberals before? And I said I wasn't in either. I was one of the few people, there were thousands of people leaving the party, and I was one of them. So I'm walking the opposite direction, who joined the Lib Dems about, when we were still called the Democrats, I think Paddy wanted us to be called, and he lost the Ben restaurant. So I have no sort of baggage in this, but I am a liberal, not a social democrat. Although there are liberal-minded social democrats, oddly, and so these areas, some of these labels are a bit confusing, and I was having a conversation earlier in the bar, sort of conversation you have at conferences about where Vince stands politically. And Vince is a hard to categorise man, and in some ways he is quite an old school social democrat, some would say. But in other ways, I've seen him, despite his protestations he might make to the contrary, within the coalition, arguing for more economically liberal policies than the Conservatives are willing to tolerate, particularly on open markets, trade, immigration policies. You know, he's a sort of Economist magazine liberal, as well as being in some ways a social democrat. So I think it's not as straightforward as that here was a Liberal Party which was compromised by the introduction of social democracy, but I do still think that we ought to be, as I said, a sort of authentic and unambiguous Liberal Party. On the other parts, well, essentially the criticism of me was the same in both. Well, I mean, in a way, there's an amazing test case of this, which you can go to the Korean Peninsula, because in the top half, they've tried a heavily state-centralised, illiberal model, and in the bottom half, they've tried capitalism and freedom and democracy. And I know which one of those two countries I'd rather live in. And the first time I went to India was in 1989, and it was a very closed economy then. The Indian economy was opened up in the early 90s. And of course they've still got a long way to go, and of course there are still huge numbers of extremely poor people in India. But the country has been transformed to quite a large degree in the last 25 years. The numbers of people in absolute abject poverty, and the number of people who suffer from horrendous sort of medieval illnesses, is coming down and down and down and down in India and in Southeast Asia and other parts of the world. And the prosperity of those areas is rising markedly. Very quickly, when I was a boy in the 70s, South Korea was poorer than North Korea. It was comparable in income to East African countries. It's now one of the most prosperous, I think it's the 11th biggest economy in the world. Their living standards per capita are comparable to ours. They have these impressive companies, you know, LG and Samsung and Kia and Hyundai. They have a Secretary General of the United Nations. They've got the next Winter Olympics. You name it, they are an important country in the world who have completely transformed their standing. And that is because they have embraced liberalism. They made the transition from being military dictatorship to an open democracy and a free society. But they have embraced economic liberalism as well. And the countries that have done that have on the whole prospered, and those who have turned their back on it, as Ukrainians could tell you, have seen the contrast between their circumstances and those of the countries that have pushed forward with liberal solutions and they want those liberal solutions themselves.
Thank you, Jeremy. Ryan.
Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I agree with Jeremy on that point. I think the evidence is quite clear that capitalism has been a catalyst for social and economic progress in most countries. But of course, sometimes markets have inequities and inefficiencies. So there is a role for government. We're not, as an economic liberal, I'm not a libertarian. I'm sort of pro-market, not free market. And there is a role for government there. And indeed, what plays into that is a sort of positive view of society, that actually, on the whole, if you look at most indicators, there has been social and economic progress through the decades. Liberalism has obviously helped with that, but so has sort of good policy making and other campaigns and progress in technology and science, etc. And that's, for me, the difference on the right of politics between the negativity which is trumpeted by UKIP, who think that actually society's got a lot worse, it's more atomised, more sexualised, it's gone to the dogs, and a sort of more positive view, which is actually society's getting better. Let's use good policy to improve the problems that still exist, but on the whole we're getting better. And this comes to my core point about conservatism, which is I joined the Conservative Party because I liked its positive message around social mobility, which was, it doesn't matter where you come from, it doesn't matter your background, your identity, it's what you do and your values that matter. And that for me was a positive view of human nature. Things can get better, things can change. And for me, that's the sort of liberal conservatism that I'm trying to champion, which is a positive one, which is completely in opposition to the negativity that UKIP trumpets. So I think that's how the Conservative Party should differentiate itself. I think, at times it has been spooked by the UKIP agenda. So, for example, before Christmas, just as the transitionary controls on Romanian and Bulgarian immigration were lifted, we did get a lot of briefing from the Home Office about, the EU is stopping us from, capping this, and it's going to be awful, it's going to be terrible. I think actually a more pragmatic response to that would have been, actually, if you look at migration trends from Romania and Bulgaria, most of them tend to go to countries like Italy and Spain, where the culture and language is similar, but also if you look over the past 5 years, that's where they've gone. They haven't suddenly come to the UK, and indeed it's very different from the situation in 2004, when only we lifted the transitionary controls and Poland came here. So really, I think we were spooked by UKIP and we went for a more negative line, when actually we should have gone for a competence line, which is actually, it's not going to be terrible, it's not going to be awful, and we can manage this in a competent way. And I think that would have been a responsible way to deal with it. So I suppose my point is that for me, the Conservative Party should be a positive party about human nature and the future of society, and that's how we differentiate ourselves from UKIP. Yes, there are people who are spooked by that, who want us to mirror what they're doing, and indeed some people want pacts with them. I think we should reject that completely and show how we're much different.
Just as a reminder, the questions were about mergers, the makeup of the negotiating team, and whether humility is appropriate.
I guess actually what I'd like to start with is the idea about the failure of neoliberalism, because actually that calls up a question. I think it gets to the root of when the markets collapsed in 2008, there was an assumption that the left would prosper off the back of it, because surely people would see that there were problems with the capitalist model and all that sort of thing. The problem is, the immediate question is, okay, well, if you want to say, let's chuck aside capitalism, what is the alternative? Because as far as I can tell, the only one that's been tried is socialism, and that didn't really work anywhere. So, I mean, it has to be said that I consider myself in many ways a social democrat. I believe in a mixed model, a mixed economy. I believe that there's there are certain things that the private sector does extremely well, and there's certain things that the public sector does very well. They're both important. But I think to sort of say that neoliberalism's failed is odd, because it's difficult to say. Well, surely if it's failed, then something else would have stepped up to replace it. I think about, just about the idea about progressive, about being positive. I think that is something that I think, by default you have to be as a liberal. You have to feel that that things are getting better. I guess it goes to what Jeremy was saying about small c conservatism, about how we need to. I do think we do need to avoid that. I think we cannot fall into the trap that I think is prevalent on the right, which is that somehow society is going to hell and it's all terrible. I think we have to look at the positives. I also think that one of the things that makes me a liberal as opposed to a socialist is that I feel that one of the most important things is getting as many people involved in the economy as possible. If you look at any sort of, you look at sort of your third world countries, what you have is you have a very small amount of people who are involved in the real economy in any way. Basically, everybody else is completely outside of it. And I think that one of the most important things is that you bring people in. You don't have a sort of crony socialism. I think that's negative, and I think illiberal. So.
Thank you. I would like 3 more questions, please.
Sorry, could my question on coalition forming be picked up there, albeit briefly, please?
I think the outcome of the last election in terms of number of seats meant that if there was a coalition, there was only one show in town, and it was a Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition. Slightly expand on your point, I think the coalition has been at its most successful when the two parties, and this goes to my initial comments, have sought to compete with one another to be more imaginative in their solution to the country's woes, and has been least successful when they have sought to try and cancel each other out and have a sort of lowest common denominator approach. And so I am broadly of the view that both David and Danny and others have made a lot of progress because they have sought to work in an intelligently collaborative way with some of the more liberal-minded people in the Conservative Party to try and bring about outcomes that we would all approve of.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. 3 more. 1 here, 1 here, and 1 here.
Yeah. John Hart, Cheadle. I remember the days, I worked in the days of Tories and Conservatives and National Liberals, and we hated their guts. They took our clubs. But what I wanted to say is a word that has not been mentioned by anybody here tonight. If you look in the dictionary, you'll find that liberal means generous.
I told him that.
You It's exemplified in the coalition because the Liberal Democrats have insisted that those in need get improvements in the tax situation, and without us, the Conservatives would never have done it.
Over here, questions.
Yeah, I just noticed that Ryan actually did support a change in the voting system, and his key argument for supporting the Conservatives was we basically live in a two-party world, and this one's less bad than the other one. I just wonder whether actually that we should be less optimistic about liberalism having won in politics, because UKIP is a phenomenon that's attracting votes from all the parties, which essentially have quite liberal leaderships, but the grassroots feel they're out of touch. There is a market for a non-liberal party. Would we have a healthier political system if we had a clearly non-liberal party and a clearly liberal party and a realignment under a different voting system?
So instead of the left-right axis go liberal or authoritarian, and the third question
is not the problem with the party's identity and the discussion we're having right now, not about the fact that liberalism itself, the definition, is a bit of a smudge. Because my idea of what liberalism is probably completely different to what other people at the other side of the room think.
Brian, would you like to go first on those?
Yes, so on the realignment point here, Tim Montgomery, who is the commentator of the Times, did quite an interesting piece, which is he sort of imagined a world 4 new parties, and it was the Liberal Party, the Nationals, the Freedom Party, and a sort of very left-wing Green Party as well. I can't remember what he called that, but that was his vision. And you would have people like Tony Blair, David Laws, in that sort of liberal parties where people like Nick Bowles, and then the National Party is more of a sort of socially conservative in the ilk of Angela Merkel and David Cameron. So it's worth looking at that. However, what I would say is, perhaps it is good that liberals are dispersed in all of the main parties, and that they're at the top of those parties advancing liberal policies. And there are many Liberal Conservatives right in the cabinet, and if you want liberalism advanced, it's probably a good thing. And when governments change hands, if you've got Liberals in different parties, that's great. The second is that, as Jeremy talked about, perhaps it's good that we have Liberals in different parties competing with each other, and from that sort of competition, you get more innovative ideas in responses to the problems that are out there. On the generosity point, I actually think the Liberal Democrats were very generous to come into coalition with the Conservatives. And I do hear often, and I think it's unfair, people say, well, the Lib Dems have sold out, they've gone into government, they've sold out on everything. But of course, politics is about compromise. And, sometimes you can come in and advance some things and win some things, but other things you're going to lose. But that's the art of politics. That's what politics was all about. But also, what I would say to Conservative Party members who are often very critical of the coalition, actually, I think Conservative Party's done very well out of coalition, not only politically to some extent, but also in terms of many of the policies that were in their manifesto have been implemented. And indeed, there is a sort of caricature of Conservative activists that they all want out of coalition. But actually, if you look at polling, it shows that actually most of them would prefer another coalition with the Liberal Democrats to a minority government. And Tim Bale's done a lot of polling on that. So we're not a swivel-eyed loon lump. We're very pragmatic as well. So don't fall into stereotypes.
Thank you, Nick.
I would say about Liberals being in different parties, I would agree actually, broadly, that's probably a good idea. The thing about that is that only works when you have coalitions, basically, because that's the only time that those people can interface and actually make policy that changes the country. So I'd say that's an argument for coalition and probably for a vote for the Democrats. Talking about the sort of liberal, non-liberal party realignment of politics, that would be very interesting. And actually, I think that it is the first past the post system that stops there being more variety, that keeps the party system kind of where it is. I think, for instance, there's a sort of Christian Democrat-sized hole in our politics. You've got people like, I don't know, Philip Blond or Tim Montgomery. You can see them being in a party, essentially a sort of a non-liberal party. That's the essence of it, which is about social conservatism and sort of a larger state that can make this happen. So that basically, you are using sort of a social market model to create the society that you'd like, which is based on those sort of Christian Democrat values. So that would probably exist. There would be, I think, if you had a different system in the first past the post, you would have a fracturing of the current political model.
Thanks very much.
I just want to pick up the point on Liberals in other parties. I think the Conservatives are a confused coalition themselves, and they have some Liberals in their ranks, and there are some Liberal-minded Labour MPs. It's become an unfashionable view in the Labour Party, so they keep quite quiet, but there are quite a few. My frustration is why we aren't doing more to win these Liberals to the Liberal Democrats. Yeah. And look, we are on 9% in the opinion polls. It seems to me that there are two categories of voter, in crude terms, that we spend a lot of time tracing after, who are very unlikely to be seduced by us. One of the people are the sort of angry left, who voted for us because they thought Labour were insufficiently left-wing. Seems to me that if we're in coalition with the Conservatives, we're unlikely to win their support at the next election. And the other are protest voters who voted for us because they thought we'd never be in government and they'd never be responsible for their own vote. Other people voted for us because they believed in our policies and they liked our candidates and all that stuff. But there are those two categories of voters that I think we chase after, and it is an exercise in futility. And the second category will vote UKIP or they'll vote Green, they might vote Labour. I think there's another category of voter, it might be smaller in numbers, but at least there is a plausible, strategically coherent pitch to them, which is the Liberals in the Conservative Party and the Liberals in the Labour Party. But if we're not unambiguous about our own liberalism, and we spend our whole time trying to tell people to the left of Labour that we really haven't changed very much and we still stand up for what they believe in, and we tell protest voters that yes, we're against the system as well, even though we're in the government. We, in other words, make the journey from being a party of protest to a party of government, we get stuck halfway and become a party of protest in government, and try and make sure that protest voters still like us. we can't then be that surprised if the authentic Liberals in the Conservative Party and the Labour Party can make a reasonably compelling case, which I think Ryan has, for Liberals making their way in other parties. So if you like, if I summarise my pitch tonight, it's that the Liberal Democrats should be an authentic, unashamed, unambiguous, undiluted Liberal party, because that would make us intellectually coherent, and it may also make us electorally successful in the short term as well as the long term.
Couldn't see there before. About 12 minutes, and I know there are some incredibly bright, feisty women in the room, and none of them put their hand up. And so I'm wanting a woman to put her hand up because we've had no women questioners. Okay, I tried. Men, go for it.
Right, taking, if I may, a slightly sort of bigger societal picture about what you were just saying about sort of going after the liberals in other parties and in society generally. In the situation we are at the moment, where there is no single party that you can guarantee on any issue is going to come out and fight for a liberal position, and is likely to come out with some form of conservatism just to be safe. Isn't that one of the reasons why we have such a horrible debate in this country on all kinds of issues pretty much pick almost anything you like, whether it's immigration or sex, that any issue that pops up, some awful authoritarian nutjob is going to come up and say ban sex, kick all the immigrants out, and whatever you do, don't have sex with them. And there is nobody who's actually going to come up and say, oh, hi guys, I'm a liberal, and there is an alternative viewpoint from your weird UKIP hating everybody stance.
I'll try and ask a question rather than speech. What's the most liberal way of dealing with the economic deficit and the most liberal approach to governmental spending going forward?
Thank you very much. You get to start. Nick?
Well, yes, I think this goes back to Jeremy's point about there's not enough. Liberalism is, I guess, probably it comes down to the fact that authoritarians, it's very easy. You get angry and you yell in one direction, whereas liberalism is very thoughtful and very studied, and you have to think about these. So I think that's the problem. I think that probably we don't shout loud enough. But if we shouted louder, maybe we would be as liberal. I don't know. It's a fundamental existential question, I'd say. In terms of the liberal approach to the deficit, I mean, I would say that I actually think that the one that's been chosen isn't too bad, which is essentially one in which you say, okay, well, we've got too much spending, we've got a structural deficit, we need to bring it down. We're not going to we're not going to ignore it, but we're also not going to completely slash it. We're not going to start sort of, okay, well, let's just get rid of DEFRA, and whatever happens, happens. You're sort of saying, well, you have to take a bit from here and a bit from there. So I'd say that's probably the most liberal approach in my opinion.
Right.
So on the sort of liberal approach to economic reform, I think it is to pursue a reform agenda which goes towards achieving surpluses in budgets. I think it's important from a short-term economic perspective, but also a sort of intergenerational fairness point as well. And I think that's very important. In terms of some of the things that you might do, I think we have to be looking for innovative market-based approaches to some of the big problems. I mentioned some of those in the speech, but alternative sources of financing, for example, social investment, private capital, private sector engagement in public services like health, like in education. I think, as long as we keep it free at the point of use, I think we should have a plurality of providers in those markets, and I think that will make it more efficient and bring in more capital in the long term. And then on top of that, I think it's about shifting, for example, the burden of taxation. I want to lower the burden of taxation, particularly on income, and maybe move it more towards unearned wealth, for example, on housing. And I think in the Treasury there is I think there is some popularity towards that move, even in conservative circles. So I would look at doing that. And then I think the third approach is to empower individuals to be more productive and profitable in the long term. And I think that needs focusing on two things. One is building a high quality education system, and that means starting very early and making sure that we have a high quality free school system, for example, which we don't have at the moment, and I think our focus needs to be more on that. And the second is allowing people right across the income spectrum, even for people on low incomes, to be encouraged, to be supported, to set up their own businesses, self-employment, to encourage entrepreneurialism. I think that's how we'll get more productive, profitable individuals in the long term.
And Jared.
2 points. One, on the deficit, I agree. I think the government has taken broadly the right approach. But if I had a criticism, it's that far from going too far too fast, I think we have probably gone at the minimum speed that we could have done whilst keeping the show on the road. I mean, we are still borrowing about £260 million every single day. Our debt interest payments alone are about £1 billion a week of your taxes, not going on schools or hospitals, but going on debt repayments. Would be go up from about £50 billion a year to about £70 billion a year by the end of the next Parliament, just interest on debt alone. So I think we have no choice but to go down that track, and I think we are right to be doing so. I just want to. They're slightly separate things. One of them is about, I think liberalism is a bit about a sort of state of mind. And we can spend a lot of time, as Crowley said, about what it is to be a liberal. And I personally, it comes a bit to the SDP point, I personally don't like the preamble to the Constitution, which is on the cards, which sounds to me like a definition of a political movement designed by a committee of people who had different views from each other. Well, because that's exactly what it is. And so it says we seek to balance these, and then it's like lots of completely different things. So well, we're not having, I'm not leaving this room until I've got my name and word on the list as well. And in a way, it's a sort of spoof of the definition, a not very good definition of liberalism. What is liberalism? And I've talked about economic liberalism and social liberalism and personal liberalism. I think it's also about having an optimistic state of mind that is a belief that we can do better in the future than we can in the past. I know that's a cliche, but there's a fantastic bit in the Times today which asked UKIP voters what they are unhappy about. There's a very long list of what they're unhappy about. And then it said, is there anything that you think is good about the country? And a big pause, and they said, the past is good. I think that when it comes to attitudes towards the deficit, or it comes to our attitudes towards house building for future generations and so forth, I think we as a country have been pioneering and have achieved great changes throughout our history. And what I don't want us to be is a party that spends or a country and a party that spends our whole time fetishising the past, whether it's about the public services we have or whether it's about all other aspects of our lives, rather than thinking that our generation can do better than that and can come up with better ideas for the future. And I think it's about being an outward-looking rather than inward-looking country as well, which is why I'm strongly supportive of us having a clearer pitch at the European elections than we have in the past, because I think it's important we stand for something and invite people to support it rather than standing for nothing much in particular. But my final point on this section, in a way this is the return to my nervousness, is that I can understand why our party's pitch at the general election is that we have no preference between the other two parties. It is essentially a tactical device that we can't show our hand, because then we would obviously be compromised in whichever direction we didn't show our hand in. And I don't want us to be sort of defined as an annex to one of the other two parties. So I understand all of that. My nervousness is that we come to define liberalism as a result of that tactical device as being the exact midpoint between conservatism and socialism. And what's more, if Ed Miliband becomes more right-wing, we have to become a bit more right-wing to maintain that central point. And if he becomes more left-wing, we have to become a bit more left-wing. But none of this is based on whether that's more liberal or whether we assess that as being in the national interest. It's about splitting the difference between the two. It's a sort of insipid centrism. And if you watch Borgen, the Danish fairy. I think she's the Prime Minister of the moderate party. And there's lots of good things about being moderate. On the whole, I prefer, most of the time, moderate people to people who are more aggressive and confrontational. But it's not the same as liberalism. Liberalism is quite often not a moderating force. It might be quite a pioneering, radical, innovative, inventive force. And so I suppose my sort of, bring me back to the beginning, in case you don't get another chance to speak, my sort of message of the evening is that we should be an unashamed, unambiguous liberal party, and that will make us both more electorally successful. And as I say, we'll be clear in our own minds about what we believe and what we stand for.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. We're drawing to a close now. It's 9:15 and that's when our fringe session ends. I'd like to thank you all very much. I'd like to hope that you will join me in thanking our three panellists.